Wow, what a difference a month makes, huh? This is where we were 3 weeks ago. This is what we were thinking about. Valentine's Day and all that. And the joy of Valentine's Day. I guess coronavirus was around, but it wasn't near the concern that it is now. But that was 3 weeks ago. I still am kind of in a heart kind of a mood myself, because this was us yesterday. And married my youngest son off to a fine Christian girl. We're very happy at the merger of our families. And I know none of you know anything about doing the ceremony for your child and then coming in the next day and preaching. I mean, I know none of you know that. At least one I know who does know all about that. But we're still kind of basking in the glow of that from yesterday. And I am reminded they're getting on a plane today for their honeymoon. And these are, it's a bittersweet and the greatest joys and the greatest fears too, I guess, all merged into one set of events. But this is what we have been looking at as we have been tracing through the message of the Exodus. We've been asking the question, what's the condition of your heart? And that's still a valid question, and that's a question that we'll cycle back around to again. This morning, I want to peel a layer down on some of the same set of events that we looked at a few weeks ago, but now asking this question: what is God's part in the plot line? Now, God has been evident all along in the plot line of Exodus, but that's the question we're going to take up specifically, particularly in the midst of a set of events that are all terrible. So what is God's part in the plot line? So just to refresh your memory, if you need refreshing, here are the 10 plagues. I mean, they start unpleasant, grow to uncomfortable, and then end with downright deadly. Why does God do this? Now, on one hand, I think our inclination could be, I know mine definitely is, well, the Egyptians were rotten, they're holding God's people in bondage and all that, so the Egyptians really have it coming. It gets harder, at least to my mind, when I ask, why did God put Moses through this? You remember Moses' complaint at the end of Exodus 5? Now, it's at the end of Exodus 5. We're very early in the book of Exodus. But he comes to God and says, I've done exactly what you told me to do. I mean, I didn't even want to go to Pharaoh. But I've done exactly what you wanted me to do. And ever since I've done what you told me to do, I've seen nothing but misery. There's been nothing but misery on these poor people. And why did you ever even send me? You've not done anything to deliver your people at all. That's at the end of Exodus 5. Now, the beginning of Exodus 6 is coming. Exodus 5 is followed by Exodus 6, in which God says, well, now you're going to see what I'm going to do. I believe there are people in this room that, as we sit here right now, are at the end of Exodus 5, in the plot line of your life, in the plot line of your life story. Lord, as far as I know, I've done everything that you've wanted me to do. And I don't know what you're up to. I don't know why I'm seeing the misery that I'm seeing. And I can tell you that I have been at the end of Exodus 5 in certain stages of my life. Stage of life that I'm in right now, I've seen more Exodus 6 and following, but I can relate to. I can even say to you, it's an inevitable part of the Christian life, walk with Jesus Christ, that there are going to be end of Exodus 5 periods in your life and walk with God. And so the question of, so where is God in this plot line? Where is God in the story? Becomes all the more important. Particularly if you're at an end of Exodus 5 stage of the plot line of your own life. So what is the goal of Exodus? And you know, if you read Bible commentaries, if you read expositional treatises of Exodus, here are candidates. I mean, this is what even Old Testament scholars will say when they're summarizing the theme of the book of Exodus. You know, the theme is let my people go. The theme is free Israel from bondage and slavery. The theme is get God's people to see they have nothing to worry about. Demonstrate God's power to a stubborn unbeliever. But you know, God actually says, if this were a seminary class, by the way, I'd make this a multiple choice question. And it'd be a trick question and people would hate it, but I would really enjoy it. But God actually tells us before he ever engages, before he ever implements a single plague, the heart of what he's up to. And it's not that these are all wrong. You know, so I'm Xing them out. It's not that these are all wrong, but those are mere subplots to the major plot. Here's what God actually says he's up to. Exodus 6:1, now you're going to see, but Exodus 6:2 reads like this: I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but not by my name Yahweh. I did not make myself known to them in that way. I established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they sojourn. And now I've heard the groaning of the sons of Israel because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage. And I've remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the sons of Israel, I am Yahweh. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from their bondage. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm, with terrifying power. Then I will take you for my people. I will be your God. You will know that I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out from under the oppression of the Egyptians. And I'll bring you to the land that I swore to give you to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I will give it to you for your possession. I am Yahweh. At the beginning of the year, the leadership at Christ Life Church said, we want to devote the year 2020 to getting to know God. Exodus 6 says all these plagues, all the events, all the plot line of the book of Exodus is to get to know me. Not just know about me, but get to know me. I am Yahweh. And these events, stressful, anxiety-inducing, painful as they are, inconvenient as they are to facilitate the getting to know that God is Yahweh. Major point number one, I mean, it may seem obvious, but major point number one, I am Yahweh. He's a burning bush kind of a God. He's a powerful kind of a God. I am Yahweh. He's no cuddle bunny, yet he's gracious and benevolent. He's powerful, but not just arbitrary in how he exercises his power. He has purposes rooted in recognizing that I, God, I, your God, am Yahweh. So you know why the coronavirus is now spreading through the world? You know what God is up to? I'll tell you exactly what God is up to. Something. I mean, we're going to see the plot of Exodus. It's complex with ebbs and flows and all the. I don't know exactly what God is up to. Hopefully, in 10 years or maybe a year, we'll look back and see, boy, God did a remarkable thing. But I do know this: by the time this story is over, whether it's a year from now, 10 years from now, 100 years from now, the basic bottom line will be something that involves recognizing that God is Yahweh and that He is the God. Now, I'm sorry, but all my illustrations for the next 2 years are going to come from the wedding and all that, okay? So I've got one here, okay? A little less than 2 years ago, it's hard to believe, my sister had a hemorrhagic stroke and died. I'd say she died instantly, but I don't know why God did it this way, but it took her 4 days to die. Awful. Terrible. I'm not going to say that this is why God did it. And I know that my sister Hope is healthy, happy right now, so I'm not worried about Hope. Though I tell you what, it really hurts that she was not there, at least physically present yesterday. I'm surprised it wasn't pouring down raining, because I know she was crying from heaven. But it was in the aftermath of her death that my youngest son, Jesse, and Katie reconnected. I mean, our families are connected and whatnot, and anyway, comforting my family, came to the funeral and all that. And Katie and Jesse had known one another from childhood, but Jesse was going to college 8 hours away in Cedarville, Ohio. Katie's up here. I mean, they had no reason to reconnect except this awful event. They reconnected, began texting one another or emailing one another. And out of that pain and death, a love seed was planted and blossomed, such that a little less than 2 years later was yesterday. Now, I don't know all of God's purposes in that, but I mean, we can see. There are purposes we can't see, but we can see that one. And we praised God's name yesterday, up to and including remembering that out of this tragedy, loss, and death, God brought something beautiful in His redeeming grace out of it. Major point one, I am Yahweh. And part of the pain and struggle that occurs is to forward the recognition that I am Yahweh. Now, other significant things God says along the way. One, I have indeed seen the misery of my people, and now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. Now, it's interesting how God puts that to Moses, and I understand there's some, what Old Testament scholars would call anthropomorphic, I can almost not pronounce it. Anthropomorphic, I should have practiced it in the mirror. There are some anthropomorphic overtones to this. That is, it almost sounds like they cried loud enough and long enough that it finally reached Him way up there. And we know he's right there, present, omnipresent. But he's accommodating how it must have felt on the ground. I've seen you, I've heard you, and the cry of the Israelites has reached me. And now I, Yahweh, am going to act. In other words, part of the character of God is, I'm not just sovereignly indifferent. Oh, he's sovereign, but that doesn't make him just indifferent to your people. Yeah, suck it up, deal with it. I'm sovereign. I am Yahweh, but I have indeed seen the misery and heard the cry of the suffering of my people. "200 years ago, this was the state of African Americans in the United States, at least in the southern portion of the United States. And, of course, it's now quite popular, quite a focus to remember how great was the injustice, how great was the suffering of African American people in the United States that were enslaved. Enslaved unjustly, horribly, treated like animals. I mean, literally treated like animals. I mean, look at this trading block. It's like they're trading cattle. But God wasn't just indifferent to that. So is it too far a stretch to draw a parallel that there was this grave pain and suffering? But God's not indifferent. He sees the misery, hears the cry, and through a complex series of events, redeems and rescues. 75 years ago, it's a country in Southeast Asia. Maybe you've heard of it, Korea. That was oppressed by the Japanese for 35 years. Not quite 70 years, about half the time that Israel was, but 35 years and up, isn't it? Great pain, suffering, oppression, misery. Is it too great a stretch to observe the broad pattern of the character of God to suggest a parallel? That God indeed sees the misery and hears the cry and acts through a complex series of events, yes, to redeem and rescue. These aren't the only two examples from history we could draw from, and I know that particularly the second one is up close and personal for many of you in this room, maybe all of us in this room. But I can say this, I just observed this. Missio Seminary, where I teach, training institution that exists to train missional leaders for the church of the 21st century. We exist to train frontline ministers. 30% of our student body is Korean. Another 25% is African American. Now, I, for one, am glad also for the Caucasian population as well. But I can't help but think, I can't help but draw a correlation. I mean, you'd almost have to be blind and deaf to not see that there's something about God's redeeming grace, particularly at work in the complex plotline of the events of history, for Korean people, for African American people, that causes a disproportionate number of those two population groups to be those who come to know Christ, those who are interested in forwarding the kingdom purposes of God, such that a disproportionate number of those two populations are studying in Southeast Pennsylvania, in North America, United States, to forward the kingdom. I'm just going to take a big risk, skate way out on the thin ice of theological speculation, and suggest that's not a coincidence. That perhaps there is a correlation because the character of God is such, the character of Yahweh is such, that he's interested in all people everywhere, yes. He's particularly interested in relieving, redeeming, and doing his gracious work among the oppressed and suffering. Other significant things God says along the way. At plague 4, that's when it's not just frogs and bugs, but at the plague where they begin to bite. This is the biting flies or the hornets. The Hebrew word is ambiguous as to what kind of insects they are, but they're either stinging or biting or both, all right? At the moment, it moves from merely uncomfortable to actually painful. God says, but on that day I will deal differently with where my people live, so that you will know that I, Yahweh, am in this land. I will make a distinction between my people and your people. Now there's a point here that is easily overstated. I don't want to overstate it. But I also don't want to be so careful to not overstate it that I don't state it. Because there's a point here. There's a benefit to being a person of God. Now, in this case, in the narratives of Exodus, if I were teaching a seminary class, I'll lay a couple of 50-cent words on you and then simplify it and translate it into just plain English. But if this were a seminary class, I'd say part of what God is doing in the Old Testament literature in general, and in the narratives of Exodus in particular, is establishing linguistic and epistemological categories. I said they were going to be 50-cent terms. That is, giving us language to use and ways to think about the character, ways, and purposes of God. That's what that means. What that means is it's like when you're raising a child. You know, when you're teaching a little child to speak, you say, you know, what is this? What is this? And the chair. I mean, you're very dramatic. You pronounce more precisely than normal. You touch it. It's very concrete and tangible. That's what God's doing in the narratives of Exodus. It's very tangible, very concrete. I mean, so today, I'm not going to say there's such a distinction between God's people and those that are not God's people that you can drive through a neighborhood and recognize, oh, that's a Christian. See how green the lawn is? Their lawn is greener. See? I mean, it doesn't work that way. But you know that it about worked that way? Even that pronouncedly in Egypt, between the land of Goshen, where Israel was, and the rest of Egypt. He made it very dramatic because he's establishing concretely, tangibly, a point. So I'm not going to say that it's that dramatic, concrete, tangible, and specific in our context. So I can't guarantee that, you know, if you're a Christian, you don't have to worry about coronavirus. Coronavirus will hit everybody else, but Christians will be safe. I can't say that. I can say this. There's a benefit to being a child of God. I cannot say that if you're a Christian, you'll never get sick. I can't say if you're a Christian, you'll never experience loss, you'll never experience tragedy. I cannot say that. But I can say that if you're a child of God, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, whatever happens to you, whatever trial, whatever injustice, whatever oppression you may endure, it will work for good. It will eventually, whatever clarification, it will eventually, but dramatically, be for good, for your good, which is something I cannot say if you're not a believer, if you're not a child of God, if you're not a follower of Jesus Christ. I can't even say that if you are a follower of Jesus Christ but are in a state of rebellion. I mean, okay, it could be disciplinary measures that God is using, so in that sense it's for your good, it's purposeful. But if you're a child of God, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, there is a purpose for whatever trial you endure. But not only that, there are trials, pains, and sufferings that other people may endure that you will not. Some of these we know. They're pretty obvious. There are pain and sufferings that come with sexual promiscuity. That a person who is a faithful follower of Jesus Christ, who is monogamously sexual only with their life partner to whom they're covenantly committed in marriage, will never experience. There are diseases that occur commonly among the sexually promiscuous that are extremely rare to the point of virtually non-existent. Save from, and I'll tell you what the exceptions are, for medical professionals, like my wife, who is a neonatal intensive care nurse. I mean, if she got stuck with a needle from someone who is sexually promiscuous, okay, she could get it that way. But other than that, the laws of God, the directions of God are such that if you are living the way God designed you to live, you're virtually impervious to certain afflictions that are common for those that don't. Now, if you in fact have engaged in a previous stage of life or whatever, I'm not saying you can't be forgiven and redeemed. I'm just saying that this pattern, that I deal differently with my people, that there's a distinction in the way I work with my people versus those that are not my people. That pattern is still in play even today. Thirdly, this is plague 8. Right before plague 7. Right before you move from death of livestock to death of people in the form of hail. So not just boils, which is, that's extremely painful. But hail, that's going to kill people when it hits. It's going to kill people when there's famine and starvation. Before that plague, God says, and that plague is the one where God says, you Egyptian officials, you've been listening to that. We're now, you've had 6 other plagues. So by now you ought to know I mean business. But plague 7, hail, I'm telling you the hail is going to be intense enough and large enough that if it hits a cow, it's going to kill the cow. If it hits someone who's plowing in the field, if it hits a person, it's going to kill the person. So, at least bring your people, bring your animals inside, because I'm telling you, there's hail coming. So that's where there's a distinction between even the Egyptians, who feared God enough to at least bring their people inside, bring their animals inside, and those that didn't. But God says at this point, just so you know, plague 1 could have been meteor. I could have wiped you all out. With plague 1. So why am I doing it so incrementally and progressively? Because I could have wiped you out completely. But I've raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. I don't know what all God is up to here, but we can see a couple things. And I can see this much. By this point, plagues 1 to 6, already dispatched, already overcome and humiliated, are the Egyptian gods Apis, Heget, Set, Watchet, Hathor, Sekhmet, Sunu, and Isis. And there's a whole set of Egyptian gods that have been overcome and humiliated. I mean, absolutely schooled, defeated, God kind of tweaking their nose, thumping them over, thumping them down. But you still have Sut, Osiris, and Re left, which were considered the most powerful gods of Egypt. And you got 3 left. Not to mention whatever divinity Pharaoh himself is claiming. Because the Pharaoh in the Egyptian occultish religion at that time was such that Pharaoh himself was considered a god. So you still got 3 left, 4 if you count Pharaoh, that God knows if I stop now, and by the way, they could have repented at any time and stopped it. But if I stop now, 100 years from now, maybe 10, or 500 years, anyway, next generation is going to say, oh, wow, but Ray could still have taken Yahweh. I mean, it never got to our most powerful God. So there was some battle. And you remember early on, when they're making frogs and stuff, the Egyptian sorcerers made more frogs. It still boggles my mind. So why would you do that? Oh, we can do that too. Well, great. It's like, it's coronavirus. Oh, well, we can make smallpox too. Well, great, wonderful. Why would you do that? But you still got 3 left, plus Pharaoh. And so part of what God is up to, Paul in Romans 9 is going to pick up on this. Part of what God is up to is, I've raised up a particularly extraordinarily hard-hearted set of people so that it actually gives me, Yahweh, the opportunity to show my full-bore strength right up to the sun god Re. That's not R-A-Y, even though it's sun. It's not Re, it's R-E, as how it'd be transliterated into English. But I could have wiped you out completely. Now, there is a principle here. So there's the Egyptians and all that. I also observe God does not like idolatry. He really doesn't. That first commandment, have no other gods before me. Apparently Yahweh is serious about that. So we don't have Osiris and Set and all that. But you know what idol is really common in our day, in our highly sophisticated scientific age? Capitalistic materialism. Or socialist material. I mean, pick your form of economy. But materialism. Profit. Prosperity is a rival to Yahweh. Particularly among secular people, but Christians are not immune to it. And you know what? God doesn't like idolatry. And I can't say this is what God is up to, but more than one economist that I've heard on the Bloomberg channel, on the Lou Dobbs channel, on Fox News, on CNN. I mean, it doesn't matter what liberal, conservative. Many an economist I've heard even the past week have said things like that. The economy would be really good if it weren't for this darn coronavirus. Now, I hope the coronavirus is eradicated tomorrow. I really do. Hope the vaccine's eliminated. But I can't help but observe Yahweh doesn't like idolatry, and he's very resourceful at getting rid of it. God's purposes, just observing some broader patterns. God's purposes always forward God's name. Now, forward God's name is a Hebraistic way of saying forwarding God's reputation. So, forwarding recognition of God, God and His ways, God and His character, forwarding God's name. Not just forwarding God's name, but forwarding God's praise. There are always going to be people who chafe against and ridicule and mock and scoff instead. But God's purposes forward God's praise among His people. But not only that, God's purposes always, always, always forward God's mission. Now here's where I'm going to just observe in passing with a little smile. It is very common for good, Reformed, Calvinistic, Presbyterian theology. I know I'm not talking to anybody in this room. Good, Reformed, Calvinistic, Presbyterian theology to get those first two. They're not going to miss those two. But sometimes they don't always get that third one. So it's not just that God is sovereign and powerful and big, and He's bigger than you are, He's more powerful than you are, and you better stop and worship it. But God also has a mission in play that involves relieving oppression, overcoming injustice. God's purposes forward His name, His reputation, forward His praise, and forward His mission. All three. All right, so the story of the Exodus is a complex narrative of plots and subplots, purposes, conscious and unconscious, explicit, implicit. That means stated and unstated, said, unsaid, complex, ups and downs, ebbs and flows. And yet, above it all, behind it all, through it all, is God Himself. And we see that in Exodus. I think we see it pretty clearly. Now, I'm going to ask you to pause here a moment. And in place of the Exodus, put instead my life. The story of my life is a complex narrative of plots and subplots, purposes conscious and unconscious, explicit and implicit. Can I just say to you, whether you know it or not, whether you're conscious of it or not, whether you're able to articulate it or not, in the story of your life, above it all, behind it all, through it all, is God Himself. Now, I don't know where you are in the plot line. Are you one of the Egyptians? Are you one of the Israelites? Are you Moses? Are you Pharaoh? But I can tell you this with significant confidence. Yahweh is in it. So I want to close this morning with a simple question to ask, not so simple to answer. In the complex storyline of your life, where is God in the plot line? If I can speak for you, I'm just going to say for Todd Mangum. Here's my natural instinct. Unredeemed, unsanctified by the Spirit of God, of course, okay? But here's my natural instinct. The story of my life is I was born and raised in Richmond, Virginia, came up to and got to have a career in theology, teaching theology, and God has really blessed me. That's how I'm inclined to tell the story of my life, the plot line. And you know, I'm doing this, and then God has really helped. God has really blessed. God has really... When actually, what I see in the Exodus story and the unfolding storyline of Scripture is, this is what God's doing in the world. This is God's plot line. This is God's mission. And here's where Todd Mangum fits into it. Now, Todd forwards the mission. Sometimes Todd gets in the way and has to be taken down a notch, dressed down. Sometimes Todd needs... But the plot line, the heart of it, the main body, the main flow, is God's mission. And I actually fit into that rather than the other way around. You may not have that inclination. I suspect you're not that different from me. But I do want to close this morning asking you, where's God in the plot line? He's in it. And he's probably more prominent and more at work, even in the frustrations, even in the pain, even in the hurts, as well as the blessings, than we may realize. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you for the